All right, strap yourselves in because we're diving deep into the world of geopolitics today. Our listeners have sent us a fascinating book that really makes you think. Alexander Dugin's Eurasian Mission.
Ah, Dugin. He's definitely a thinker who provokes, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And this book lays out his vision for what he calls a multipolar world. It's a
Yeah.
worldview that challenges a lot of assumptions about global power, civilization, even how we understand history itself.
It's fascinating how he doesn't just critique the existing world order, he offers a whole other way of seeing things rooted in this concept of Eurasianism.
Right, so let's start there. What exactly is Eurasianism? When you hear that term, what should pop into our listeners' minds?
Well, at its core, Eurasianism says there's this distinct civilization that stretches all the way from Europe to Asia, totally separate and different from the West.
So not just a geographical term then.
No, it's much deeper than that. Think shared cultural and historical identity, a common thread that goes beyond national borders. Dugin argues that this Eurasian civilization has its own unique set of values, traditions, even its own destiny, separate from what he calls the Roman-German West.
Okay, I'm already hearing a pretty strong critique of the West embedded in this.
Oh, absolutely. Dugin is extremely critical of the West. He argues that its focus on individualism, liberalism, and material progress is fundamentally at odds with the values of Eurasian civilization.
And this is where Russia comes in, right? He sees Russia playing a key role in all of this.
Absolutely. Dugin views Russia as the heartland of Eurasia, a nation with a unique historical mission to resist Western influence and forge a new path for the world. He really digs into Russian history, pointing to its long tradition of standing up to outside forces. You know, the Mongol invasions, the Napoleonic Wars, the Cold War. He sees a pattern there.
So he's constructing a kind of grand narrative of Russian exceptionalism.
You could say that. Dugin believes that Russia has this special destiny, almost a spiritual mission, to lead the Eurasian world into a new era, one that breaks free from the dominance of the West and creates a multipolar world order.
Okay, so we're starting to get a sense of just how big Dugin is thinking here. But this idea of Eurasianism, it's not entirely new, right?
Right, the concept has roots in early 20th century Russian intellectual thought. Thinkers like Nikolai Trubetskoy and Pyotr Savitsky were already exploring these ideas in the lead-up to the Russian Revolution.
So Dugin is building on an existing foundation.
Exactly. He's taken these early Eurasianist ideas and woven them into a much more elaborate worldview, drawing on all sorts of sources. I mean, we're talking philosophy and history, geopolitics, even esoteric traditions. It's a complex tapestry.
And that brings us to his fourth political theory, right? This is where he really tries to break away from the political systems we're all familiar with.
Exactly. Dugin argues that the 20th century was dominated by three major political theories: liberalism, communism, and fascism. He sees all three as flawed and ultimately leading to dead ends.
So if those are all off the table, what's the alternative? What's he proposing?
Well, that's where the fourth political theory comes in. It's his attempt to create a completely new political paradigm. It goes beyond the traditional left-right spectrum and draws inspiration from pre-modern traditions, spiritual values, and a deep connection to the land.
I'm trying to grasp the scope of this. It sounds incredibly ambitious, almost utopian in a way.
It's definitely radical, and it's a vision that you either find inspiring or alarming. Love him or hate him, there's no denying that Dugin is a compelling thinker who really forces us to look at the world differently.
Okay, so we've touched on some big ideas here. Eurasianism, Russia's role, this fourth political theory. But let's get into specifics. How does Dugin see this Eurasian civilization actually working?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. What's the core elements of his vision is this concept of autonomies. They're basically self-governing communities that are built around shared cultural or ethnic identities, not traditional nation-states.
So less about drawing lines on a map and more about recognizing communities based on shared values and traditions.
Exactly. Dugin sees the nation-state as this artificial construct of modernity. He proposes a system where power is given back to these smaller, more organic communities. These autonomies would have control over their own affairs within this larger Eurasian framework.
So it's like a federation, but with cultural identity playing a much bigger role.
That's a good way to put it. And these autonomies wouldn't necessarily be bound by geography. They could be linguistic, religious, ethnic, even connected by a shared historical experience. It's Dugin's way of recognizing and preserving the diversity within Eurasian civilization while still having some level of unity.
That's a huge shift from how most of the world is organized today.
Yeah.
But how would these autonomies function in reality? What's the relationship between them and some kind of central authority? I guess we'll have to unpack that more in the next part of our deep dive.
We will indeed. And we'll also dig into some of Dugin's more controversial ideas, particularly his views on the United States and his call for a global revolution. Buckle up, it's going to be a wild ride.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Alexander Dugin's Eurasian Mission. Last time, we started unpacking his vision of Eurasianism, and it's clear that this is not just a rehashing of old geopolitical ideas. He's talking about a total transformation of how we think about civilization, about power on the global stage, really about the future itself.
You hit the nail on the head there, and one of the most striking pieces of his vision is this concept of autonomies being the building blocks of this whole Eurasian civilization.
Right, we touched on that. So can you remind us, how would these autonomies actually work in practice? What does that look like on the ground?
Okay, try to picture it this way. It's not about drawing lines on a map, like traditional borders. It's more like recognizing spheres of influence based on a shared sense of identity. So these autonomies could be ethnic groups, they could be religious communities, even people united by a common history or experience, all sorts of things.
So a group with this strong shared identity could basically govern itself, make its own decisions within this larger Eurasian system.
Precisely. They'd have a large degree of control over their own affairs. Education, social services, how they develop their economy, how they preserve their culture, the whole works. Dugin sees this as a way to empower communities, to let them truly flourish based on their own unique values and traditions.
Okay, but that brings up a question. Wouldn't that much freedom lead to fragmentation? I mean, how do you stop the whole thing from dissolving into chaos if everyone's doing their own thing?
That's where Dugin's concept of a strategic center comes in. He envisions a central authority that would be in charge of things like national defense, foreign policy, managing resources that are strategically important. Basically, the big picture stuff that needs a unified approach.
Right, the things that affect everyone, where you have to act as one.
Exactly. Think of it as a kind of overarching structure that provides security and stability for the whole Eurasian civilization. But within that structure, the autonomies would still have a lot of freedom to chart their own course, to make their own choices about how they want to live and govern themselves.
I'm starting to get the picture, how it all fits together. But I can't help but think, wouldn't this system inevitably lead to tension between the autonomies and the strategic center? I mean, what's to stop the central authority from becoming too powerful and overstepping its bounds?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that Dugin addresses head-on. He acknowledges that there needs to be a balance of power. It can't be all top-down. He talks about checks and balances, ways for the autonomies to have a voice in the decision-making process at the strategic level.
So there's a feedback loop built in, not just a one-way street.
Exactly. Dugin is very clear that real unity can only come from dialogue and consensus, not by forcing people to conform. That balance between unity and diversity is, for him, a core principle of Eurasian civilization.
It's a pretty complex system. I can see how it would be tough to put into practice in the real world, but hey, that's what we're here for, to explore these ideas. Now, another piece of Dugin's thought that I find fascinating is his view on land ownership. He's got some unique ideas about how we should relate to the land, to nature.
You could say that. He completely rejects the Western concept of private land ownership, the idea that you can buy and sell pieces of land. He argues that that leads to exploitation and a disconnect from nature, from the earth itself.
So what does he propose instead?
Well, he envisions a system where the land is held in common. It belongs to the people of Eurasia as a whole. But the autonomies would have the right to use and manage specific areas based on their needs.
So it's kind of like a stewardship model, right? You're not the owner, you're the caretaker.
That's a good way to put it. Dugin believes that we should see ourselves as stewards of the land, responsible for its well-being, not just exploiting it for profit. And this really ties into his broader critique of modernity.
Right. He sees the West's focus on material progress, on technological advancement as a kind of spiritual sickness, a loss of something essential.
Exactly. Dugin believes that modernity has alienated us from our roots, literally and figuratively. He says we need to reconnect with the land, with tradition, with a sense of the sacred, if we're going to create a truly healthy and sustainable way of life.
I think that idea resonates with a lot of people today, even if they don't agree with all of Dugin's more, shall we say, extreme ideas.
Yeah, I think so too. There's definitely a growing awareness of the downsides of modernity, the environmental costs, the social costs. People are looking for a way to live in harmony with nature, to find a deeper meaning in life.
Right. It's like there's this longing for a simpler way of being, a more connected way of being. And I think Dugin, in his own way, is tapping into that. But okay, back to the practical side of things. How would you resolve disputes over land use in his system? If no one owns the land, how do you decide who gets to use it for what?
Right, that's a really important question, and Dugin does offer some thoughts on this. He emphasizes the importance of dialogue, of consensus building, of respecting traditional customs and practices. He doesn't lay out a step-by-step plan, but the idea is that you work things out together with a deep respect for the land itself and for the needs of different communities.
So it's a more organic approach to governance, one that's rooted in the local context, in the specific relationships between people and the land.
Exactly. And it goes back to his idea of boundaries rather than borders. Remember how we talked about that? These fluid, flexible lines of demarcation that reflect how interconnected communities really are.
Right, that really stuck with me. Borders are these hard lines that divide people and often lead to conflict. But boundaries, as he describes them, are more porous, more adaptable. It's a really interesting way to rethink how we organize ourselves on this planet.
It really is. I mean, it makes you question a lot of assumptions about national sovereignty, about globalization, even about what it means to be a citizen of a particular place.
It does. And whether you find Dugin's vision utopian or dystopian, there's no denying that it forces you to think differently, to challenge the way things are. And speaking of challenging assumptions, we can't wrap up this part of the deep dive without talking about Dugin's views on the United States. This is where his critique of modernity gets very, very pointed.
Yeah, no kidding. He sees the United States as the embodiment of everything he finds wrong with the modern world. He calls it rootless, materialistic, imperialistic, basically a force for destruction.
He doesn't mince words, that's for sure.
Not at all. His critique of the U.S. is deep and uncompromising. He sees it as a homogenizing force, erasing cultural diversity, as a system built on exploitation, and ultimately as a threat to the very survival of Eurasian civilization.
And this ties back to his critique of modernity as a whole, right?
Mhm.
The U.S., for him, is like the ultimate expression of that, with all of its excesses and contradictions.
Exactly. He sees America as this country that's lost its connection to the land, to tradition, to any sense of the sacred. It's driven by this insatiable thirst for power, for technological advancement, for material wealth. And for Dugin, that's a recipe for disaster, not just for America, but for the whole world.
And that leads him to call for a pretty radical solution,
Yeah.
right? A complete overhaul of the global order.
Right. Dugin believes that the current system, with the U.S. at the top, needs to be dismantled. He wants a multipolar world where power is distributed more evenly, where different civilizations can coexist and cooperate without one dominating the others.
And he sees Eurasia as playing a key role in that.
Absolutely. For him, a strong and united Eurasia is the key to counterbalancing American power and creating a more just and equitable world order.
Bold vision, to say the least. And as you can imagine, not without its controversy. But I think we'll save that conversation for the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at the impact of Dugin's thought, how Eurasianism has evolved as a movement, and what all this means for the future of global politics. Stay with us. We're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into the mind of Alexander Dugin. We've spent the last two parts unpacking his vision of Eurasianism, from his fourth political theory to his pretty harsh critique of the United States. But now I'm curious, how much of this is actually happening in the real world? What kind of influence does Dugin really have?
Yeah, that's the question that keeps a lot of people up at night. I mean, it's hard to say for sure, to draw a direct line between his books and specific government policies, but his work has definitely found an audience in certain circles, especially in Russia, where his book Foundations of Geopolitics has even been used in some military academies.
Wow, okay. So are we talking about Dugin as some kind of puppet master pulling strings behind the scenes?
I think that's a bit of an oversimplification. It's more like he's an intellectual architect. He's laid out this blueprint for a Eurasian order that clearly appeals to certain parts of the Russian elite.
And how does this all connect to Putin? I mean, some people see Putin as putting Dugin's ideas into practice on the world stage, especially with moves like the annexation of Crimea.
Well, there's certainly some parallels in their rhetoric. Both Dugin and Putin talk about Russia's special destiny, the need to push back against Western influence, this vision of a multipolar world. But you have to remember that Putin is a pragmatist at the end of the day. He's not going to follow any ideology blindly, even if it fits with his goals.
So more like shared interest than some kind of master-disciple relationship.
Right. Putin might be drawn to Dugin's ideas because they offer a way to justify actions he was already leaning towards taking. It's like Dugin's providing the intellectual framework, the historical context, for things that Putin wants to do anyway.
So it's like Dugin's writing the soundtrack to a movie that Putin's already directing.
Haha, that's a good way to put it. And that soundtrack is resonating beyond just the Kremlin. Dugin's ideas about Eurasian identity, his critique of Western liberalism, his call for a multipolar world, they tap into feelings that run deep among many Russians.
So even if he's not calling the shots directly, he's helped shape how a significant portion of the Russian population sees the world around them.
Exactly. And that's what makes him so interesting, even for those who completely disagree with him. He's put together a worldview that clearly has staying power, even as things shift and change on the global stage.
Okay, so what about Eurasianism as a movement, as an ideology? Is this a purely Russian phenomenon, or does it have a wider appeal?
Well, Dugin himself sees Eurasianism as a global force, a kind of alliance that unites everyone who rejects the Western-dominated world order. And while it's certainly strongest in Russia, there are echoes of his ideas popping up in other parts of the world.
You're talking about his call for a global revolutionary alliance. Who's he hoping to bring into that fold?
He's appealing to a whole range of groups who feel marginalized or threatened by the current system. You've got far-right nationalists in Europe who see him as an ally against immigration and multiculturalism. You've got anti-American activists in the Middle East who see him as a champion against Western imperialism. Even some left-leaning intellectuals who like his critique of capitalism find common ground with him.
It's like this strange mix of ideologies, all united by their opposition to how things are right now.
Right, and that's one of the things that makes Dugin so fascinating and honestly bit unsettling. He's able to pull together these threads from different ideologies, from different historical periods, and create this grand narrative that speaks to a surprisingly diverse group of people.
It's like he's tapping into this global undercurrent of dissatisfaction, of people wanting something different. And he's channeling that into this vision of a Eurasian-led world order.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Whether you think he's a genius or a madman, there's no question that Dugin is a force to be reckoned with.
All right, well, as we wrap up our deep dive, let's take a step back and consider the bigger picture. What are the implications of all of this, of Dugin's thought, for the future of global politics?
Well, if there's one thing that's clear, it's that his ideas are part of this larger shift towards multipolarity. We're moving towards a world where power isn't so concentrated in the hands of one superpower, but more spread out among different centers of influence.
So less American dominance, but also more potential for conflict and instability.
Exactly. And that makes the future a lot harder to predict. There are both risks and opportunities, and it's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
So what do we do with all of this? As individuals, as citizens, how do we navigate this increasingly complex and unpredictable world?
The first step is understanding. Understanding the different forces at play, the different perspectives, the different motivations driving global events. And that's what we've tried to do in this deep dive into the world of Alexander Dugin.
We haven't set out to endorse his ideas, but to engage with them, to understand their appeal, their potential consequences, and their role in shaping the world we live in.
Right. And as we move forward, it's critical to think critically, to question assumptions, and to engage in thoughtful dialogue, even with people whose views we might find challenging or even repulsive.
Because the future isn't set in stone. The choices we make, individually and collectively, will shape the course of events. And understanding the ideas that are shaping those choices is more important than ever.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.